Hey everyone, it's Drew. So this is going to be the tutorial for kind of mimicking Zaha Hadid. We're going to base it off of a painting that Marianne had sent me, simply because the one that she picked I think is really good texturally, and I think there's a lot that we can talk about as far as the relationship between Rhino and kind of hand-drawn things are concerned. Throughout the tutorial, I'll be talking about like the different moments in which you can actually do things by hand if you'd like, or you could do them, of course, staying in the computer. Really, it depends on if you want to explore that kind of hybridized process or if you just want to stick in the computer realm for now. So the big thing that I want to say about this tutorial is to save early and save often. Obviously, as you've all seen with Zaha's work and with her images, they're very sophisticated, and I'm going to try to keep it as memory independent as I can, but you're probably going to have a pretty big file size and your computer's probably going to be doing a lot of processing simply because that's the nature of what Zaha Hadid does. So first thing that we want to do is make sure that we have a separate file name. So if we do file, save as, we just want to make sure that you're working on a new file that you're able to just exclusively mess around with just the chair surface in. So the first thing that we want to do is create a copy of all of the things that we have by typing in copy and then clicking one point here. What we want to do is keep a consistent increment across the board. The chances are you'll probably have to come back to something at some point, and knowing the exact distance between those things is going to be very helpful. So if we type in, let's say, 10 feet, it's going to give us a radius, and it'll consistently move around in the same distance. And if I hold down Shift, then that'll snap it to a 90-degree angle. So I'm just going to copy one over to the left here. And just so we don't erase anything or mess anything up that we've done, we're going to go ahead and lock the original drawing. And what that's going to let us do is, if for some reason we accidentally delete a certain portion of this model, we always can unlock this and reintroduce it into the model. So now that we have a copy here, really the only things that I'm going to use for this tutorial are this group of lines and the surfaces, the blue surfaces, which I can select by hitting surfaces, right-clicking on it and hitting select objects. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that over another 10 feet because that's the increment that we have chosen. It doesn't matter what unit it is as long as it's like a consistent kind of stepping down the line. And now we only have the information that we absolutely need. So I'm going to go ahead and select the surfaces by right-clicking, selecting objects. And I'm going to go ahead and deselect the ones from this model by control-clicking over that to deselect those. And I'm going to go ahead and join those surfaces. Yours might already be joined. You'll know it's joined if you click on it and the whole thing lights up and it says a polysurface has been added to the selection. And basically what that's going to do is this is now a solid object. So I want to pull up the Hadar Aliyev Cultural Center that I've talked about a couple times during class, and I want to really start to look at some of this folding that's happening on the side of the building. I think it would help for this tutorial to really kind of show the fluidness and the sophistication behind what Zaha does. So I'm going to kind of mimic something like this. I'm also going to mimic this kind of touchdown point where you see like the curve comes down and it touches the ground, whereas in mine it just kind of stops and then there's a straight shot down. So of course yours is going to be different than mine, and that's one thing that I want to point out with these tutorials. You can pick and choose what to do from these tutorials. We're not going to mandate that you do every single thing in this tutorial, and we're going to emphasize that. Like, if you don't think something's important to your drawing or the way that you anticipate your drawing ending up, don't do it. Like, find a different thing to do, or just skip it altogether. So in order to get that curve basically to terminate right here and treat that as the ground point, I'm going to make sure I'm on my hide layer. If you don't have that, just create a new layer, maybe called cutting planes. And once we're on that layer, what we can do is, I'm going to change the color quick. If we type in rectangle, basically I'm going to click on this point where there's like this weird intersection, and I'm going to make sure that I make a rectangle that's bigger than the couch surface itself. And then I'm just going to select that. If this gumball thing doesn't show up, there's a button down here called gumball. You want to make sure that's highlighted. And what that'll let you do is drag it up and down, left and right, so on and so forth. So basically I'm just going to make sure that my couch surface is in the center of that rectangle that we just created. And I'm going to type in planar srf. And what that's going to do is create a plane that treats that line that we just had as a boundary. So you can see that some of the model is underneath the plane and some of it is above, but it happens right at that vertex point. So what I'm going to do is select my couch surface and type in Boolean Split. And it's going to ask me for the cutting surfaces or poly surfaces. And of course, we just made this layer called cutting planes, so this is it. And what I'm going to do is just right click, and you'll notice that it's split into two separate objects. So if I delete this, the bottom part of that surface is now cut and separated from the top part, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. So this is more what my building is going to look like, quote unquote building. So what we want to do is I want to make another copy of this by typing in copy, clicking on this point, typing in 10 feet, hitting enter, holding shift, and copying it 10 feet down the line. And I'm actually going to hide my surfaces real quick and then delete these layers. I don't really want these for this part of the drawing. So now we just have the surface itself, and I'm going to type in explode. And what that's going to do, of course, is when I click on this, it's not going to select the whole thing, but rather individual surfaces. So I'm going to delete all of them except for that main top couch surface. And we want to try to get these swoops. It was coincidental that this kind of looks like the Hadar Aliyev Center to begin with. But what we're going to want to do is, let's go ahead and hit edit copy or control C, and then edit paste. And what that's going to do is basically create another one in the exact same spot. And I'm just going to move it over a foot using the gumball tool. So you'll notice that if I do edit copy, edit paste again, I'm going to be using the keyboard shortcut Control C, Control V sometimes. So if you don't understand what I did, I mean, it's just a quick keyboard shortcut, and I might not explain it in the moment because I'm so used to doing it. I can type this 1 foot in again, can copy and paste. If I hit this green arrow, it remembers the thing that I said last time, and I just want to make like maybe 5 of these. And I think that looks pretty good. Actually, we'll only do 4. We'll do it 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th one will be the original surface. So what I want to do is I want to rotate each of these to start getting this folding effect. And the way that we're going to do that is by clicking on the far right surface and then clicking on this red kind of arc tool right here. So these arrows are indicating the points that we're looking at this thing clockwise. So if I actually want to rotate it counterclockwise, I'm just going to type in -10, and that'll rotate it by 10 degrees counterclockwise. And I'm going to do that for all 4 of these, except I'm going to up the increment by 10. So we did -10 for this one. We'll do -20 for this one. We'll do -30 for that one, and -40 for this last one. And then what we're going to do is we have this corner point, and we're going to make sure that this one's touching this one, touching this one, touching this one. And the way we're going to do that is by clicking on it and typing move, hitting enter and clicking on that point, and clicking on the next one in line. And then I can hit shift and click on it to add to my selection. So I'm just going to do that for these remaining ones. And then ultimately move it back over here. So the way I did that so quickly, if you right click, it'll actually redo the command you just did. So I've just been right clicking and basically using that as a shortcut. So once I put it onto this ground point over here, it looks pretty good, I think. You can start to play with the heights, like if you wanted to like move this stuff back 3 inches and then start to stagger stuff, you're certainly welcome to do that. I probably will just to show you kind of more with this gumball tool. So I'll move that back 3 inches. I'll control click the far surface to deselect it, and I will do the same thing. Control click, move it, control click, move it. And what that's going to do is basically stagger these back so there's more of that kind of intermediate area like we have in these folded areas. So if I select all four of these, I think that if you look at this right here, you can see that the surfaces are overlapping each other. So I'm actually going to move these up a little bit as well. So same thing, except with the blue arrow this time. Going to move it up 3 inches, control click, move it up 3 inches, control click, move it up 3 inches, control click, move it up 3 inches, and control click. So you can see that there's a little bit of intersecting still happening, so I might just move it up like another inch. And it's still there. How dare you? Okay, so we'll move everything up 1 more inch. How about that? Sorry, this is a pretty monotonous part of the video. All right, great. So we can see that it doesn't really touch back down to this original surface. So what we're actually going to do is I'm going to hide the intersections for right now by hitting this light bulb right here. And I'm actually going to save, so Control S or File Save. You should do the same because it's about to get weird probably. I'm going to go ahead and select this plane and making sure that my surfaces tab is activated. I'm going to type in offset SRF, and what that'll do is basically give a thickness to this surface. So we can notice that the arrows are pointing up, which means it's going to try to extrude upwards. So if you just click on the plane, it's actually going to bring it back down. And I think a good thickness, I think we moved it up 4 inches, so I'm going to give it a little bit extra, maybe say, or maybe it was 5 inches. I'm basically just going to type in 6 to give it a 6-inch buffer, and hit enter again, and that should give me a thickness to that plane that we just made. It's a little bit thick for my liking, so maybe I'll do like 3 inches instead. Just as long as this stuff's kind of touching and it looks semi-believable as a building, I think we're in pretty good shape. So I'm just going to do that with the rest of these. And if we look at it in rendered view real quick, we're going to see that it looks relatively Zaha, especially kind of over on this side. And certainly these are settings that you can play with and start to mess around with. The artistic freedom in this portion is way higher than it's been for the rest of the semester. We're going to have some drastically different results depending on the person doing each drawing. So we're going to go back to that Boolean stuff real quick. If we imagine this as the curve on the Hadid Aliyev center, we can see that there's some kind of punch out on the bottom. We're going to start to imitate some of that. So if I go to my cutting planes tab and I activate it, I can actually type in box and hit enter. And what that's going to let me do is effectively click on a point and click on the opposite point and bring it upwards. And that's basically just going to create a solid surface for us to play with. So this part's going to be kind of arbitrary. I just want to kind of mimic this really nice kind of recession that's going on at the bottom of the screen here. So what I'm going to do is click on that piece, and I want to make sure that it's intersecting this. And we'll know it's intersecting by like this kind of spazzy blue and green situation happening. And I also want to bring it out a little bit. I'm going to make a copy of it by holding down Alt key on my keyboard and clicking and dragging upwards, and you'll notice that just creates a copy. I'm going to shift this over a little bit. The gumball you can use to elongate the shape or shorten the shape or make it thicker in some instances. So I'm just going to do like a quick composition on this wall rather arbitrarily, just as long as we have some kind of variability in this facade is what we're shooting for. So if I imagine something like this, I'm going to shorten it. I'll drag it this way, make it thinner. I'm going to fast forward through this part, but basically I'm just going to use those gumball commands to kind of fill up this facade. All right, this is looking pretty good. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shapes here. I'm gonna go ahead and Boolean split 4 of them and then join 4 of them. So I think I'm gonna click on this surface right here, and I'm going to type in Boolean split. And you notice that selection disappears. That's a good thing. We're gonna click on, let's say, this one, this one, this one, and this one. And when I right click, what that's going to do is basically find the difference between this surface and the 4 that we just clicked. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that surface. I'm going to deselect everything, and then I'm going to hide that surface. Excuse me. I'm going to notice that the blue is left over here. So we're going to go ahead and delete the blue as well as the thing it was embedded in. We're going to go ahead and delete these 2, and then of course these 4. So now when I type in show, you'll see that that's actually hollowed out. And if I go into rendered view, you'll notice that there's kind of these recessions inside of that. I'm going to go back into shaded view real quick and maybe move this over a tad bit. Now we're going to do what's called a Boolean Union. And the way we're going to do that is basically selecting this, 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 and this. And we're going to type in Boolean Union. And you'll notice that it changed color. Boolean Union is kind of unpredictable on how it assigns layers. But if you click on that surface, which should all be 1 now, these parts, these little wings are no longer individual. I can just right click on surfaces and hit change object layer. If you'd like, you can keep going with that kind of stuff on the front. I'm just going to do 1 by typing in sphere. And then basically just kind of clicking on the center point, and you'll see the sphere grows from where I clicked once I start dragging it. I'll bring it a little bit over, a little bit back, a little bit up. Just something to kind of fill out this little curve right here. I think that's great. And now I can do the same Boolean split command by clicking on the thing I want to subtract from, typing in Boolean split, and then clicking on the object that we just made. So that's looking great. I'm gonna go ahead and file save. You should do the same. And I think that we're in pretty Zaha-esque territory. Obviously, this is a very quick tutorial, and you can spend as much time as you want kind of perfecting these really kind of smooth forms if you'd like to. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to be doing that. So the image that Marianne sent to me that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we're going to put it on a new layer called picture. You don't have to do this. This is probably just something that I can do. So if I type in picture, what that's going to do is bring up a bunch of PNGs and JPEGs of things that I can bring into Rhino. So I'm just going to go to the image that Marianne had sent me a couple days ago, and it's this drawing, or painting rather. And if I double click that or hit open at the bottom, I'll basically be able to do the same thing we did with the rectangle and simply bring it into Rhino so I can look at what's happening. So you can see that with this building, Zaha starts to do a lot of elongation. We're not going to do that yet. She basically has this in some kind of road and a couple of other buildings kind of scattered throughout. We're going to start to mimic some of what she's doing there. And the way we're going to do that is by, I'm going to go ahead and bring these over. Our increment was 10 feet, so let's go ahead and just make it a multiple of 10, let's say 100 feet. And now that's kind of on an island by its own. If we type in curve and click on kind of this bottom left corner, and actually I should probably do this in a projected view. If I hit project at the bottom down here, basically what it's going to do is it's going to snap it to the C-plane, which is this kind of gray background that we have going here. So if I type in rectangle, you'll notice that I need to actually move this whole thing down because it's placing the point somewhere down here. So I'm just going to draw this quick. And if I go to select this guy, turn off project, type in move, click on this corner and bring it down, they are now in line with each other. So actually I'm going to go ahead and kind of mimic this road that we see going through the entire project like this by clicking curve or typing it in and basically going into the top. I'm going to click on this corner first and then go into the top view. And then what I can do from here is basically Again, I can hold down Shift to lock it into a 90-degree angle, which I'm going to do. And then I'm just going to kind of do something like this, and maybe the road starts to curve back, and then maybe it even, well, we shouldn't branch off on it quite yet. Basically, what we're going to do is drag this, or keep this where it is. Excuse me. And we're going to do what's called array curve. So array CRV, what that's going to do if we have this selected is say select the path curve, and it's going to be, this is our path curve. And it's going to ask us what the number of items we want on it is. I'm going to say 5, and we're going to keep it as freeform, and we're going to hit OK. And what that's going to do is distribute 5 copies of what we just had along this road. You'll also notice that in this painting, this is the only thing that's like an entire building. The rest of them are just kind of fragments of the building, and we're going to do the same thing there. So let's say that we want to at least show this as something different. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this 180 degrees and probably delete all of these things. Maybe this one we can just get rid of these 3 in the main building. Or, sorry. Woo! We're going to get rid of these 2 in the main building. We can just leave this one as the main building itself with none of these extra things. And then this one we can rotate like 90 degrees or something. I actually might rotate some of these other ones too, just so it's not too consistent. So now when we look at it, the only thing that's still the same about it is kind of this even distribution. So I'm just going to kind of drag it along. I want to basically just make sure it's somewhere along this line. So maybe these 2 get a little bit closer together, and that one stays at the end. And then I'm going to go back into my top view and make another line like this. Bring it down. And maybe they kind of start to meet back up, right? So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to bring this, select this, and do array CRV. We're going to select the path curve, do another, I don't know, maybe 7 to make it asymmetrical. And then we're just going to do the same process, just mess with stuff with the gumball. And I'm gonna fast forward through this part because it's the same thing we just did. Okay, so I think this is starting to get distributed pretty nicely. One thing I did want to cover real quick is the scale command. So we can see that all of this is pretty much the same size. I'm going to just kind of pick some random ones and type in scale. Make sure you type in the whole thing because there's scale, scale 1D, scale 2D. We just want the one that says scale. And if you click on a corner and type in like 1.5, it's going to enlarge it by a factor of 1.5. So I'm going to do the same for these ones. And if I want to make it smaller, of course, I can say, you know, multiply them by a factor of 0.75, and that'll make them smaller. So I'm just going to mess around with that for a couple more seconds. So I will fast forward again. All right, so because this is the main focus, I went ahead and scaled it by a factor of 3, so it's 300% of its normal size. And now all that's really missing from our model to this kind of space over here, 1, the textures, which we'll get into a little bit later, but 2, this kind of groundwork or this kind of broken up surface underneath. So if I actually go back over here and type in, let's say, explode, and then I grab my top main surface that we've been dealing with since the beginning, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-C or edit copy, and then Control-Z or edit undo, and then edit V or Control paste. Or Control V, I don't know, I might have messed that up. I don't really know what I just said, I'll be honest. And basically what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to scale it so that it covers this entire area pretty much. So I'm going to go ahead and do something like this. Make it really wide. And again, I'm just doing that by clicking on the squares on the gumball tool. And then we'll make it wide the other way. And we'll notice that if I go ahead and put this on the cutting planes layer, it's not quite intersecting everything that it needs to be intersecting. So what I'm going to do is give it a little bit more vertical depth, maybe even rotate it a bit this way. Basically, I just want to make sure that most of these things are visible. So if I go ahead and lock this, I'm just going to make sure that all the blue is no longer underneath this. So the way I'm going to do that is by going into my perspective view and basically just looking at it from underneath, clicking this blue arrow and dragging it up until there's no more blue showing. I'm going to fast forward because I'm going to do the same process. All right, so now that we've got those all adjusted, we're going to go ahead and delete those two roads that we did. And we're also going to unlock this surface that we just made. And you'll notice that it's actually kind of off kilter, so it might actually not be the best surface to use. So I'm going to go ahead and do that same process of exploding the surface and copying it, undoing the explosion, and then re-pasting it. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it is 90 degrees before I do this stretch. So I'm going to type in rotate, click here, and hold down shift to make sure that it's a perfect 90-degree angle, and then I'm going to re-stretch the surface. So I'm going to type in move and bring it down to this corner, and now I can do scale 1D. And what scale 1D is going to do is if I click this bottom corner and the other one, it'll only stretch in one direction. So I'm going to do that to make sure that it goes to this point, and I'm also going to do it this way to make sure that it gets to this point. And I'm going to change the layer yet again, but delete the one that we had before. I want to give it some more height again, and I'll probably rotate it 180 degrees, and I'll bring it down. Actually, I think it's in a pretty okay spot. I don't think anything's really clipping through the bottom, so I think we're in pretty good shape. What we're going to do now is go into our top view and make sure that this project button is checked for this. And what we're going to do is hit the grid button right here because we're going to be creating another grid for this surface. So if I go ahead and type in line and then click on one end of the top and then one end of the other, I'm going to be able to select that line. And what I want to do is type in divide. Actually, let's not do that yet. Let's draw a line along the other side too. And then we can just kind of select all of this and hide it. So now I want to go ahead and type in length to see how long this thing is. It's 1,842 inches. Yours will probably be different. I'm going to go ahead and divide it into 20 different points. Actually, let's say 30 for the long one and then 15 for the short one. And then we're going to do what we did in the first Rhino tutorial, where we basically just click this line, and we can either individually copy them like this, or the faster way to do it is to say array linear. And we know that we have 30 items here, so we're going to type in 30 items, and basically just click from one point to the next, and it'll automatically arrange it all the way down the line. You might actually have to go one more in order to get that full length. And then we're just going to do the same thing, array linear. So this one is, what did we say, 15? So I'm going to type in 16 and then click this spacing, and we have a grid much faster than we had one before. So what we're going to do from here is basically hit show while we have our grid selected and move it down. And then we're going to do the intersect two sets thing again, or alternatively, we can just split this surface. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and make another copy of it. So I'm going to say copy and move it over. I'm going to turn project off, move it over 100 feet. Let's say 200 feet because that's kind of close. And basically all we have to do from here is get rid of our perimeter lines, these four outside ones, and extrude these upward. So now we want to select this surface and type in split, and basically just select all of these red things that we just made. And we want to deselect the surfaces. We can do that just by toggling the layer visibility. And then when we right click, it should split everything into a bunch of different pieces. So now we can delete these red lines, or these red planes, excuse me. And this piece didn't look like it cut, it's fine. But basically now we have a bunch of individual pieces that we can assign individual textures to, which we will do right now. So I actually hand drew a texture that we're going to assign to each one of these checkerboards. And the way that I'm going to set that up is by, I basically just hand drew this and took a picture of it and then brought it onto my computer. And if I right click that image and open it with Photoshop, I'm going to be able to crop it down to a perfect square. It has to be a perfect square. I suppose it doesn't have to be, but it certainly is going to help you as far as scaling and things are concerned. So if we use this rectangular Marquee tool and we left click and drag, we notice that it can be any proportion that we want it to be. But if we hold down Shift, it's actually going to lock it to a 1:1 to a 1:1 ratio. And then once we're happy with kind of the placement of it, we can go ahead and crop that down. So Zaha actually uses this kind of like light brown, desaturated brown, which is actually pretty close to what we have here. But what I'm going to do is basically just go to like Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and I'm going to saturate it a little bit more just to get more of that, I guess, brownish-ness to it. We just want to make sure that we don't go too crazy with it. You can also start to adjust the hue, as we can see on this. And I think I am okay if it looks like, I don't know, like this. So now what I can do is do a File, Save As, and save it as a PNG or a JPEG, it doesn't matter. Texture test is what I'm going to call it. And then, of course, if you're not happy with the way this looks, you can do texture test 01, texture test 02, blah, 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 blah. So now I'm going to want to go into my Rhino file, and I just want to deal with these surfaces. So what I'm going to do is select the cutting planes, right-clicking on that layer and selecting the objects, and then deselecting that one. And then I'm going to go to my Isolate tool, which, of course, is this gray light bulb with the stricken through black and yellow box here, and that's going to hide everything except for the things that we just looked at. And now we can go over to Properties, Material, and we're going to make a new material, and we're going to make it, I don't know, a custom one, and we're going to call it Texture Test Zaha, and we want to turn on this color layer right here. And what that's going to do is prompt us to select a file, which is going to be, of course, our texture test. And it doesn't look like anything happened, but if you're in a rendered view, you're going to notice that it stretched it across the entire thing. We, of course, want to reset the texture for every square, just like Zaha does. And the way that we're going to do that is by texture mapping. So if you go to the top view, you want to make sure that Project is checked off right here. And we're going to go to the Texture Mapping tab right here. And we're going to go to Apply Planar Mapping. And what that's going to prompt us to do is pick the first corner of the plane and the second corner of the box. So we know that this is a single tile, so we'll click on the top left and the bottom right. And then we're going to hit Enter. And you'll notice that it resets that texture across the entire thing. So now if we go over here, we're going to notice that texture repeats itself. And that's certainly one way that you can start to integrate hand drawing into this project. So I'm going to go back to my shaded view real quick and then type in show just to see what's going on with all of our friends that we left behind. I think we're done with this grid. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. So now we need to set up a view that we're gonna, I guess, make the final version of. But before we do that, you'll notice that in Zaha's painting, she messes around quite a bit with perspective, like it looks really stretched and crazy. So I want you all to make sure that you're going to set view and making sure that you're in perspective. And this is gonna get trippy, so go ahead and save. If you're in perspective mode, you can do what's called a Dolly Zoom. And it's going to be chaos. But basically, if you type in Dolly Zoom, like Dolly Parton, I don't know if I can make that reference, and hit Enter, it's going to say click and drag in perspective viewport to adjust the lens length. So if I click and drag downwards, you're going to see that there's like this real kind of vertigo situation, and that stretching and elongation that Zaha is so famous for is starting to occur. So basically you just want to kind of mess around with that function until you find kind of a compositional thing that you're happy with. We can kind of see that we don't quite have the same amount of, I guess, fill that Zaha Hadid does. So I'm going to go back to my perspective view, and I'm actually going to start to make some of these elements a little bit larger. Actually, it might be good because she has kind of these layered mountain scenes to just kind of copy and paste some of this stuff by holding down the Alt key and dragging it over. And we can even start to play with some rotations. We can start to play with the overall scale of this thing and kind of the width of it. And I think that's kind of interesting. We can drag that over. As far as the textures are concerned, it's going to, of course, scale those with it, which is pretty nice. And I think if we actually probably want to have a couple of these going backwards, or one that goes back a pretty far distance, maybe something like this. And again, this is just going to be kind of subjective and up to you all what you decide to do. But I'm going to go ahead and do that Dolly Zoom again, see if we can get this sense of vertigo. And I think that, does it look better this way maybe? Basically, you're going to want to find a position that you're pretty happy with how everything looks. So I think I like kind of this strange, surreal situation here. Maybe Dolly Zoom just a little bit more. And I'm going to save this view so I can come back to it. And the way that I'm going to do that is by hitting this drop-down arrow, hitting Set View and Named Views. So I'm going to name this Vertigo View 1 and hit OK. And you'll notice that that's going to pop up right here. And basically what that's doing is if I rotate around in here, whoops, I accidentally misaligned everything. I can go back to the drop-down, Set View, and hit Vertigo View 1. Alternatively, I can go to Name Views and just double-click on that, and it'll bring us back to what we were batting with before. So I'm going to fast forward for a couple of minutes while I just kind of fill out the rest of this space, and I will join you in a couple of seconds for you guys, but probably a couple minutes for me. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy compositionally with what's going on here. Once you have this figured out, please, for the love of God, Control Save. It's a consistent thing, save early, save often. We often yelled out group save in Lincoln just to make sure that everyone was on the same page and saving every hour. So now we're at the interesting part of the tutorial, as if all of this other stuff has not been interesting. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to do a make 2D. So basically these are all of the elements that I am using for that perspectival view, and you can see I'm going to go into a regular perspective view real quick just to show you. It's kind of chaos, and it was a lot of just kind of finagling with stuff and making sure that everything lined up somewhat well, basically like taking this and gumball transforming stuff until it looked right to me. So what we're going to do is basically select everything that we have. Hey guys, I'm interrupting my own tutorial because you don't need to actually select the green stuff or what was on the cutting planes layer. It's actually just going to slow down your computer a bunch, and it really does not matter for when we get it into Rhino. So go ahead and deselect that either by toggling the visibility of the cutting planes layer, or simply by deselecting everything, right-clicking on your surfaces layer, and then clicking select objects to just select the blue things on the screen. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Go back to our drop-down, set view, vertigo view 1, and we're going to run make 2D. So for Zaha, she obviously doesn't use a lot of line work, so we want to make sure that scene silhouette is not checked. But I think everything else on this looks pretty good. We're going to see what happens. There's a good chance that a lot of this just isn't going to process, and I think that that's probably okay. we will kind of get into more depth on this stuff once we get into the Illustrator tutorial. So I'm going to fast forward while this Make 2D loads, and I'll catch up with you in a couple seconds. Okay, so a solid minute and a half Make 2D. Let's see what the final result is. It is not the worst. I've definitely had worse Make 2Ds. So that's okay, actually. So this should be grouped if we go ahead and select all of that and type in group. What I also want to do is get a render while I'm in this view. The render also might take a while, so we want to make sure that we're in the proper view. We're going to go to our rendered viewport, and we're going to turn on the sun. And I don't know, if you want to have the skylight on, you're certainly welcome to do so, but for now we're just going to mess with the sun and make sure that shadows are being cast how we want them to be cast and all that jazz. I think something right about here gives a nice depth to the underside of these things and the oversides of these things. And if I right click on my render settings up here, I think the skylight's a bit insane, so I'm going to turn that down to maybe 0.25 or 0.5. So again, this texture is something that you can play around with. You can even look at, like, if you want to actually do some hand painting and drawing and stuff, you can actually print this out and then color it in or paint it in or whatever, and then scan it back into the computer. But other than that, it's up to you guys to kind of decide what you want to do with this kind of hands-on style of doing things. So I'm going to go back to my render settings by right-clicking. And I'm going to turn off the ground plane. We can see that it's casting a shadow here, which is less than ideal. And I think we should be in okay shape. We just want to make sure that transparent background is checked. You can probably leave these settings as are. It should be sufficient for this exercise. We'll go ahead and hit render. So again, I hope this doesn't crash your computers. It shouldn't, simply because we're running at a pretty low DPI. But as you can see, this stuff remains pretty much the same as what we saw in that last video. We have some nice shadows going on, this nice texture on the ground that we created ourselves. And I think we can go ahead and save this. We'll go ahead and save it as Zaha background render. Might have saved it to the wrong folder, but it's fine. So once we've saved that, that's great. We're going to go over to this, and we're going to go ahead and make sure that it's an okay size. So if I type in distance and click on the bottom left and the bottom right, that's 1600 inches, which is not what we want. So let's go ahead and make that, I don't know, maybe 2 feet for when we bring it into Illustrator, and we'll go ahead and hit scale. And once we have all that line work selected, we hit scale. We can basically just click on opposite corners and then drag it back down to this size. Okay, Control S, File, Save. I think that's pretty much all we're going to do in Rhino. Certainly, if this isn't your cup of tea and you want to do something closer to what Zaha does with something like this, you're certainly more than welcome to spend a lot of time doing like these environments and making fake mountains in Rhino and stuff like that. But for the sake of speeding up this tutorial and just kind of giving you an introduction to this stuff, I think I'm pretty okay with this. So what we're going to do is highlight this and go File, Export Selected. We'll do Zaha line work, save it as an Illustrator file. And if you remember, we just saved it, made it a 1:1 scale. So 1 inch in this model is 1 inch from real life. And we're gonna go ahead and hit OK. And then we're gonna go over into Illustrator. So if I go into Illustrator and open up my line work that I just created, come on. We know that the line work is going to be, it needs to be 24 inches wide. So what we're going to do, first off, actually, if your Illustrator doesn't look like this, I want you to go to Window, Workspace, and Essentials Classic. That's what I use. If you do that, I think you'll have you'll have libraries instead of links. The way to fix that is you just simply click on this links down here, and it'll bring up a window that you can just kind of put wherever inside of your workspace. So let's go ahead and make sure that this is 24 inches wide up here, which it is, and let's make the artboard match that. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of this and hit edit copy, and then I'm going to delete it. If I hit Control-0, that's going to bring up, it's going to zoom the artboard to fit the screen. Let's go ahead and make it maybe 24 inches wide, because we know that's what the line work is. And then let's go ahead and make this 15 inches. I think that'll be a good ratio, a good 5:8 ratio. Again, if I hit Control-0, that'll zoom the full screen for me. And if I hit Control-V or Edit Paste, that'll center all of this line work on the screen, and I can simply drag this to the bottom so it lines up. So it's kind of hard to see some of the green stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-A again. Alternatively, you can go to Select All. And I'm going to double click on this stroke and make it black, and then go ahead and make it like a 0.5 line point, simply because I want to use this as a reference layer. So what I actually want to do, I'm actually not going to show any of the line work for this, simply because we have a background render that will show the textures of everything. So I'm going to make sure that this layer is on the bottom, and I'm just going to go ahead and lock that one. So that leaves us with this and this kind of clipping plane surface, which I think we can actually just go ahead and get rid of. I don't know if you have that, but be mindful of what I'm deleting and what you're deleting. I deleted that because I think it was just picking up this bottom edge of the viewport. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this and leave ourselves with just this stuff. Before I do what I'm about to do, I'm going to go ahead and do File, Save. And when you open up an Illustrator or a Rhino exported Illustrator file in Illustrator, it's going to have this little ending converted. I think that's fine. We'll go ahead and save that and hit OK. We're going to go ahead and select everything and do what's called live painting. And what that means basically is that we're going to make it a giant group that we can start to color in or paint in. So if I go to Object, Live Paint and Make. Alternatively, you can hit Alt-Control-X on your keyboard. This is going to take a second, so be patient. I had you save before because there's a good chance your computer might crash here. But basically what that did is it grouped all of this stuff together. If I swap the stroke with the fill, we're going to see that we can quite literally color in everything of this painting. So in order to know what we want to color in, we first need to place the reference image. I'm going to use, again, the one that Marianne sent me. So we're going to make a new layer and call it reference image. And we're going to go to File, Place. And we are going to place that image right here. So the big thing that we want to pick up from this image is the color scheme. I'm going to go ahead and make a square, making sure that we're still on this reference image tab, and basically just make something like that and flip the stroke with the fill so that we have a solid black box. I'm going to go ahead and copy it and paste it in place. It doesn't look like it did anything, but it actually created a second copy of that thing. So that's a really nifty tool to use. Edit copy, edit paste in place. And I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcuts for the next one, which is Control-C and Control-Shift-V. So now what we want to do is basically grab a bunch of colors from this painting. So if I click on one of these solid boxes and use what we call the Eyedropper Tool, or hit the I key on your keyboard, we can actually click this area up here and it'll pick up that color. So this is the exact same color as this. And we're just going to do that for all of the different colors that we see on this image. And ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to end up painting what we have over on this artboard, the same colors as Zaha Hadid uses, just to have some kind of formal consistency between the two drawings. So I don't know if there's actually 8 colors in this. I think there are certainly 6. We could probably pick up this brown, and then we can probably pick up the white of the building itself. So I think that puts us in a pretty good spot. What we're going to do now that we have this color scheme is I would like you to make a another new layer, and we're going to call it background render. And we're going to bring it to the bottom just above kind of that gridded line work that we had before. And we're going to go ahead and place the image that we rendered previously, which of course was this guy right here. And we also want to make sure that this is 24 inches and bring it to the bottom. Alternatively, you can do edit copy, hit Control 0, and then hit Control V. And then you can simply hold down the Shift key while clicking and dragging to move it in a straight up and down line. So we can see that the render lines up pretty well. I really am not a fan of this texture now that I'm looking at it. There's a softness to the texture that she uses over here. So I'm actually going to go back into Rhino real quick. And if I click on one of these, there's what's called the opacity of the image. I'm just going to turn this down to like 50% maybe. And I think it's a lot less aggressive on the eyes when I do this. So I'm going to go ahead and re-render that. And I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go ahead and overwrite what we had before. And what that'll do for us is when we get back into Illustrator, it'll say that there's a modified link, and it asks us if we want to replace it, and we say, heck yeah, my dude. And I think that starts to look a little bit better. What we could do even further is select that image and basically open it up in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and do image adjustments, hue saturation, and then put the saturation all the way down to 0. And what that's going to do is, of course, make it grayscale as opposed to this really vibrant kind of crazy saturation, which you can do this, of course, too, especially if you do kind of her Metropolis paintings, which were like really red and stark. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to put it all the way down to 0 and hit OK. I'm also going to go to image adjustments, brightness, and contrast. And I'm going to make it a bit lighter, and I'm going to make the shadows read a little bit better. And then I can just hit File, Save. And again, it's going to ask us to update, and we're going to say yes. And now we're pretty much working with just like a black and white workspace. So if I go ahead and lock that background render, that means I can just select the blue line work that we have going on here. So we did already make this live paint, I believe. Yes, we did. So now what I'm going to do is go over to the live paint bucket. I think by default it's the shape builder tool, so you're actually going to want to look for this icon. Alternatively, you can just hit the K button. What I'm going to do is kind of start to mimic some of what she's doing here. So Zaha, you'll notice that pretty much this side, if you imagine this box, right? This face is light, this face is medium, this face is dark. So I'm going to kind of apply a similar logic. I'm going to go through it really quickly just because I don't want to spend a ton of time on the tutorial when I could be getting you guys off on your feet and kind of experimenting on your own. But if I go over to the Eyedropper tool and click kind of this darkest shade and go back to my live paint bucket, I'm going to do what Zaha's doing, and I'm going to pretend that like this front face is actually what's going to end up being the darkest. So if I click on this and this, you'll notice that it fills in with that color that we just picked up with the Eyedropper tool. And I'll do that for all of these. You can also do it for these other faces, like this one and this one and this one. Maybe not that one, maybe this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. So I'm actually going to probably fast forward, but not before I show you kind of how to switch colors. So of course I'm going to go through and kind of fill out all the ones that I deem necessary. Let's say that we want to have something a little bit lighter on this side. I'm going to go back to my Eyedropper tool and pick, let's say, this kind of medium blue, and then back to my paint bucket. And I'll start filling in these sides as blue. So like that piece would be it, that piece would be it, that piece would be it. That piece would be it. Some of these pieces would end up being that lighter blue. So basically what I'm going to do is go through this whole drawing and do a very similar switch between colors. So it's Eyedropper, pick a color, and then kind of go back over here and fill in some of these spots. So I'm going to fast forward this while I fill in the rest. So this is looking pretty good. If you get to a point where you're kind of wondering if you filled in any spots, I want you to go to your live paint bucket and just get like a really aggressive color that's not in the color scheme, like red. And if I actually like find a kind of an empty thing and just spam click it or click it a bunch of times, you'll notice that it's going to fill in everything that you haven't touched with that red. So what I'm going to do is basically just find the lightest color and fill it in with that. So I'll grab this white right here, and then again I'll spam click on that red, and the rest of it will get filled out with that white color. I mentioned that Zaha doesn't really use line work all that much, so what we're going to do is we're going to click on this live paint group, and if we click on our stroke and the transparent button, that's going to get rid of all the line work, and it'll just leave it as these kind of ominous edgeless forms, very similar to what she's doing over here. So with that, I think it would be good to note that, you know, there's this background render, but these actually end up being pretty flat. If we turn off that layer, we can see that there's a lot of really rich shadows that we probably want to include. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and unlock the background render, and I'm going to edit copy and edit paste in place. And I'm actually going to bring it up to a new layer that goes above the live paint called render transparent. And we're going to turn that opacity down to maybe like 50%, maybe even 25%, so we can start to see some of the undersides of stuff. So if we turn that off, obviously it's a pretty big difference between those two. We start to get some of the shadow, and there's a lot more grain on some of this stuff, and it looks really quite wonderful. So the last thing that I think I'm going to do for this image is start to get some of this mountain effect going on back here. So I'm going to create a couple of new layers. Let's see, she has 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is plenty. I'm going to make 4 new layers and put them underneath even the background render. So this background render is of course 100% opaque, and then the render transparent, that one's are 25%. I don't remember quite what we did. But we're going to name this bottom one background fill. We're going to name this one background mountain 1. We're going to name this one background mountain 2, and this one background mountain 3. So if we select the background fill layer, we're going to go ahead and go back to our trusty rectangle tool and basically draw one that encompasses the entire artboard. And then we can simply switch over to our eyedropper tool and click on this, and that will match the color of this to the background of our own artboard. From there, we want to lock this layer, and we want to switch to background mountain 1. So the next tool I'm going to introduce you to is the pen tool. Because these are really orthogonal and pretty jagged, what we can do is just go to this pen tool right here, and basically it's like creating a polyline in Rhino. I'm going to go ahead and click once, and then once I find kind of a good compositional way for the mountain to go, I'm going to click on the apex of the mountain, and you can simply just kind of click and work your way through the drawings, keeping in mind that because this is way in the distance, the mountains are probably going to get a lot smaller. And then we can start to basically work our way around the entire artboard and basically close it off into a single shape. And then we can go back to our eyedropper tool and click on this mountain, and that kind of gets the start of our mountain range in the background. Of course, you can start to adjust where these layers are at, how much of it is shown. But once you're done with this one, go ahead and lock it. Go to mountain 2, and we're going to repeat the same process. Doing something like this, something like that. I didn't like that point. If you don't like a point that you place, you can just hit Control Z and it'll undo what you just did. And again, we are going to close off this shape and use the eyedropper tool to get the next mountain range. We're going to lock this layer, and then for the final background mountain 3, which I just realized was a typo, so sorry about that, we're going to do the pen tool one last time in a series of kind of smaller mountains like this. Maybe it should actually kind of come up here and be a bit more jagged. And we're going to close off this shape as well. Use the eyedropper tool and select that. So now if we look back at our painting, we're going to see that it's relatively Zaha-esque. Of course, these textures are something that you're going to have to play around with. A lot of her work is very, very delicate, and a lot of her work is very dependent on being iterative, meaning you have to kind of go back and fine-tune stuff as you go. One thing that I could see right away is going into Photoshop and making this area darker, just to show that it's further in the distance, kind of back in these mountain ranges. But for what it is and for a quick tutorial, I think it's a pretty good start. The final thing that we're going to want to do is go to File, Save As, a PDF, please, because some of the PNGs aren't coming through on some of your drawings. And we'll name this ARCH221 Doyle Final Drawing Iteration 01. I can't name it that because I'm saving to the wrong folder, so we'll just go to Tutorials, Zaha, and I'm going to go ahead and save that. Make sure that Preserve Illustrator Editing Capabilities is checked. Go ahead and save that PDF. So as I mentioned at the top of the lecture, this is not what we're expecting by next Wednesday. This is for something for you to do over the course of the next 3 weeks, and I'll specify that in the emails that I send out as well. But if you have any questions throughout this process, by all means, let Garrett and I know. We're here to help you, and I know that it's a lot of information to cover in such a short amount of time. So if you have any questions, let us know. And until next time, I'm going to stop this tutorial.